very much, Ace and the chairperson, and to Dr. Daphne Khoo for inviting me here. It's so nice to see everybody in person and so many familiar faces as well. So, I was given such a difficult job, and I'm a clinician. I'm also an oncologist and a cell and gene therapy person as well. So the topic is tough. It's curing cancer or selling hope, so it's either one or the other. But I just wanted to say that, listening to our two distinguished speakers, we certainly know that the problem is real in terms of drug costs and how are we going to look after patients with such rising costs of drugs. So if you look at the global spending on cancer drugs, it's risen to USD 164 billion in 2020. That is significantly higher than 10 years ago. The annual growth rate of cancer drug pricing has gone up 14.3% over the last 5 years. And in Singapore alone, we're predicted to be spending $2.7 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, on cancer drugs by 2030, which is many times more than the last couple of years. And cancer drug pricing has gone beyond inflation, paradoxically in the face of competition. So I'm not an economist, and of course DS Health, Dr. Chong Wei Yang is an economist of high level, and maybe he can explain to me why this is the case. And I think one of the things that was really stark, and I was doing my research for this, is that quite a significant number of drugs approved by EMA, which is the European Medicinal Agency, really did not show significant survival or QL benefit. So, I am a clinician, and in fact, this morning I just rounded on a subsidized male B2 ward in oncology and went to clinic after that. And I think many of my fellow colleagues will expect me to speak from the trenches. So I think, for example, in this morning alone in clinic, what are the kind of things we look at? I mean, we're not very high policy makers, and we don't look at national budgets and having to sign off on reserves. So what we look at is, can we cure the patient? Can we make the patient live longer? Can we shrink the cancer, which is usually a secondary endpoint? Can we achieve goals with good QOL? And of course, in a country like Singapore, it's co-payment. We have a much stronger safety net than before. Can we do this without too much financial toxicity? Of course, there are emotional dimensions and last wishes. Do you want to see your daughter graduate from university, or a first grandchild being born, etc.? And these are the things that we have to deal with. And are there therapies that are futile and nihilistic? And of course, in the Asian context, there's always a sense of filial piety that I want what is best for my mother, or I want what is best for my father. Just give it to them, And that's always a big dilemma that we have to face. But again, on the optimistic side, both the incidence and the mortality of cancer has gone down over the last many years. And that's due to many reasons, but we do now have a remarkable range of drugs that I will just give a little bit of an insight into. But value-based pricing is not something I'm an expert in. I had to do some reading for this lecture. And as some of you may know, I'm a bit attention deficit. So I'm watching television when I'm doing this. And I happen to be watching a show called Selling OC, which is Selling Orange County. So don't judge me on that. I wasn't actually watching the show. But this house was priced at over $100 million. And the real estate agent gets a 3% commission, right? So that's like $3 million or more than $3 million just for selling a house that wasn't even very stylish, pretty gaudy and pompous. And to me, it wasn't very, I didn't think it was value-based pricing, over $100 million to buy this house. So I think it's possible that people that sell drugs and people that make drugs can sometimes have this skewed sense of how good a drug is. But if you look at the stakeholders in any cancer treatment, you have obviously the patients. What is best for me? Can I get more and more of this drug? How long can I live? If you get a doctor, he sits in front of the patient. His job is to figure out what is the best drug for the patient without too much side effects. Of course, you have the National Health Service in the UK, and this is a UK slide. How do I do this without busting the bank? And how do I manage and balance the budget? And what is cost-effective and what is value-based pricing? And of course, you have industry, who's the private sector, and they do want to make some money as well. And of course, a conversation with all these people can be rather awkward and tense sometimes. But of course, I think our two distinguished speakers will know that the European Society of Medical Oncology has come out with this magnitude of cancer benefit, clinical benefit scale. And it helps to create a certain transparency and structure to how do you value drugs and how are they going to be useful and beneficial to patients. Of course, curative is always better than non-curative, and they do have a score to decide, what is a high score means this is the drug that you really want to be giving as many cancer patients as possible. So I just want to give you a very, very brief history of drug development, and really it started in the 1990s, beyond the era of cancer chemotherapy. We then have the advent of targeted therapy, and Professor Robin Ward alluded to that, and precision medicine. And it all began with Brian Drucker, a very clever clinician scientist in Boston. In late 1990s, he was able to find a way to create a drug to fit into the pocket of the Philadelphia chromosome, or what we call BCR-ABL in chronic myeloid leukemia. By the way, this is an amazing feat of scientific magic because targeting tyrosine kinases was not thought to be possible, but he managed to create this green blob of a drug that could sit in a pocket, which is actually where the battery is, the ATP. And if you can block the ATP from actually getting into the pocket, you can actually stop the cancer from growing. And I believe this is still the fastest approved drug by the FDA in oncology history to this day, because almost everybody went into remission. The mortality of CML dropped tremendously, and it was just incredible to be able to see that. And I was in Boston at the time. And of course, what came next was the lung cancer revolution. And I didn't work for either Tom Lynch or Dan Haber, but they are both at the Mass General, and they created the next drug, which is Iressa. And they were able to find that certain genetic mutations in lung adenocarcinoma were vulnerable to this drug. And then they were able to design the drug and see a remarkable response in some patients. But this was an interesting drug because in the early phase 2 trials, EMA thought it was wonderful and approved it very quickly on accelerated approval. The phase 3 trial became negative, and they were really disappointed. The overall survival was not met. And this very clever, stylish chap from Hong Kong, he's a rock star, Tony Mok, decided that we don't need to do whole genome sequencing, being a very street smart and a high IQ Hong Konger. He's also very well dressed, as most Hong Kongers are. He said, why don't we just recruit patients who are Asian, never smokers, largely female, and just randomize them to Iressa or combination chemo, and he got a positive outcome. And he still remains a rock star in lung cancer. So it's a very clever way of designing a trial without doing expensive genome sequencing. And then there's the ALK inhibitors, and I think Ace will know this drug well. It only occurs in 5% of lung cancer. And Alice Shaw is also another rock star. She is now the head of Novartis Oncology. She was actually one of my medical students in Boston. And so the lesson learned is be nice to your medical students. They might become your boss one day. Like Wong Tian-En was also my husband. But anyway, in that era, I was doing cell and gene therapy with a lot of anxiety because at that time, there wasn't a lot of relevance, or not a lot of relevance thought to be related to solid tumors in cell and gene therapy. But those were the early years. And of course, chronic myeloid leukemia became the poster child of targeted therapy. The drug is Gleevec. I'll use the word Gleevec instead of imatinib. This is actually a very touching show called Dying to Survive. It's a Chinese show. Yes, I can understand it, even though my Chinese is very bad. But I watched this show twice. It's actually about an aphrodisiac seller in Canton province who was importing illegally generic Gleevec from India because it was just too expensive in China. But having said that, after the show was screened, the premier Li Keqiang, and I think in China you can pick up a phone and tell pharma companies to drop prices. Maybe I'm just saying too much here. But basically, Li Keqiang picked up a phone and said, drop all cancer drug prices. So, and in fact, that's what happened after the movie. And so cancer drug prices dropped. But again, not being an economist, I just do not understand why Gleevec has become more and more expensive in the face of generics and competition. Maybe again, somebody can explain to me. Of course, Novartis very graciously, for low and medium income countries, created a GPAP program where they were able to try to access, based on needs basis, they were able to access Gleevec to some of the poorer patients with chronic myeloid leukemia. So you can see at CML at 5 years survival was 30%, and most patients did not survive. And William Huang, the CEO of NCC, knows this cancer very well. And of course, in the modern era, it goes up to over 89%, and really, you almost have the life expectancy of a normal adult after that. So a remarkable drug.
But I just want to talk a little bit about my area of work, which is liver cancer. And I remember in 2008 in the New England Journal of Medicine, when this trial came out in liver cancer, it was the first time a targeted therapy or any drug was shown to have survival benefit. And some of you may know I had childhood aspirations to be a film director, so hence all these chips. But when I was a medical officer in Professor Chiam Ching's unit in Tan Tock Seng, anybody with advanced liver cancer would not survive more than 3 to 6 months. And our usual treatment is called M&M, which is Megace and morphine. So Megace is an appetite stimulant and morphine is a painkiller. But in 2008, we saw sorafenib, which is actually less than 3 months survival. And so when I attended the advisory board meeting in Tokyo a year later, and there were basically people from South Korea, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Singapore, I think India, we didn't think this was very impressive. So we had a less than 3 months median survival. There was still mouth sores, no hair loss like some chemo, no bone marrow suppression, but there were mouth sores, some diarrhea. And in fact, the Japanese and the Korean oncologists thought, this drug isn't very useful. And of course, Bayer sponsored our SAB. But in any case, what I wanted to say that the price of elimination was high and this drug was more than $5,000. And I believe NICE, correct me if I'm wrong, did not approve this drug initially. And in fact, the person that drove the phase 2 trial is sitting in the middle, Ghassan Abu Alpha from Memorial Sloan Kettering. And in fact, the drug was actually canned by the Bayer SAB and said, we don't think this is going to work, forget about it. But Ghassan actually moved this to phase 3 trial. The rest is history, and it was the first drug to show survival. So it is actually a giant leap for liver cancer in the sense that it was the first drug to show survival benefit. But just very quickly, I wanted to show you that since 2008 until 2020, you could now see there are more and more drugs for liver cancer. Now, hematology friends will tell you that they're not impressed by this kind of data because your best survival with atezo-bev, which is a combination, is 19.2 months. So for us, it's a big deal. For hematologists, maybe not. And then you don't have to look at the other numbers. But the problem with drug development is that one will win and one will lose. So when your control arm is beaten by a new combination, that control arm kind of dies off. And so there's a lot of attrition in drug development. Just very quickly, I wanted to tell you about immune checkpoint inhibitors. And I think doing walk around this morning in the subsidized ward, I was very grateful to ACE and the CDL list because the price of immune checkpoint inhibitors has dropped dramatically, and a lot of our patients can now afford it. But just very quickly, why was this such a big deal? Because this drug doesn't target the cancer. So what this drug does is it targets the T cells that is next to the cancer, and this is not an oncology exit conference, so don't pay very much attention to the cartoons. But in 2018, Honjo and Jim Allison, so this is Jim Allison with his band, The Checkpoints, which we went to listen to, and they won a Nobel Prize, and for what? So in 2011, FDA approved immune checkpoint inhibitors for basically melanoma, and what it does is this. So if you imagine Darth Vader is the cancer, and if you imagine Luke Skywalker is the T cell, so what Darth Vader does, and that's PD-L1, the red lightsaber is PD-L1, and the blue lightsaber is PD-1. So what this drug does is it breaks the hypnotic spell where Darth Vader is telling Luke Skywalker, don't kill me, I'm your father. So basically, once it breaks that hypnotic spell, Luke Skywalker then decides he's really the bad guy, and then so the T cell is then woken up beyond hypnosis and then kills the cancer. But it has been you have to say it's been a remarkable advance because with the advent of antibodies and immune checkpoint inhibitors, you're seeing what we call this the long tail. So the long tail of immunotherapy has really created super survivors. So you see it's in green, but if you combine immunotherapy, it's in red. So, so basically a lot more people are living a lot longer with what was previously incurable cancer. And I know Professor Robin Ward, and I read this in a literature about how she was discussing how do you price combinations, because the cost of combinations is going to be quite exponential. It's going to be an interesting thing to see how that's priced. And, obviously your odds of getting an outcome like that in red is better than going to the casino. Not that I go to the casino, but, But so here's an example. Jimmy Carter had advanced melanoma spread to the liver and the brain when he was 91 years old. He's now 97 years old and still working, amazing. Of course, I'm not here to mention the name of the immunotherapy, but it's an anti-PD-1. Of course, he had some surgery and radiation as well. But these are, of course, I'm showing the optimistic side of this drug. Of course, there are people who don't respond to this drug. And everybody who is in the field of CAR-T, and William knows this well, will always show a picture of Emily Whitehead. She was one of the first 3 patients that received CAR-T for relapsed acute lymphocytic leukemia. I guess my job is to tell you what exactly this drug is. It's actually from your blood. You take your blood, you collect the white cells, and you transduce through a retrovirus this single-chain variable fragment which can target the red spot, which is CD19. And just by doing that, you can actually wipe out people. About 90% of ALLs can actually show a remarkable response, and she's one of them. Of course, some of them relapse, but the long-term cure rate is probably still well above 50%. She's actually now 10 years cancer-free. This is one of my humble brag pictures. So when Carl came to Singapore, I had a conversation with him. It was a very difficult time. So as clinician scientists and clinician innovators, our job is not to think about costs, but our job is to think about, can we do something to improve the outcome of patients? But there's this picture of a little car at the bottom. The early CAR T cells were futile and it did not work. So the new generation CARs needed to have this super battery pack called the co-stimulatory domain. And the cost of manufacturing of the vector is also very expensive, but I believe we'll be talking about this afterwards. But she's always brought up as a poster child of CAR T cell therapy. So I think we heard that both Australia and NIC in the UK have reimbursed CAR T cells, and the ones in yellow are actually Asian countries. And so in Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, I did not know Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong, of course, to some limited extent, has also reimbursed CAR T cells for ALL at need, and of course on if you meet the criteria basis. So I think it's a very complex field, but access to this drug is potentially curative. So I think people are hoping that there'll be more and more access to this drug. Here are the 2 papers that Prof. William Huang, CEO of NCC, have generated to show cost-effectiveness in both diffuse large cell lymphoma and ALL. And there are international studies to show cost-effectiveness as well. And perhaps William can comment on that later during the forum discussion. So the person who basically I'm looking after here has signed an informed consent to say that he can publicly talk about his case. This is a case of combination therapy, and that will come very, very soon. It's already happening. So combination therapy, he's an 82-year-old retired businessman. Singaporeans will know his father, Lim Bo Seng, was a very famous war hero in the Second World War. And he came to me, and he had all kinds of cancers in his family, but he had advanced incurable liver cancer. So if you remember, I said in the 1990s, your median survival is 3 to 6 months on megace and morphine. So we put him on this trial with 2 drugs, which are anti-PD-1, as well as an anti-blood vessel blocking agent. And he's now 4 years into his treatment. But this drug combination will cost anything from $15,000 to nearly almost $20,000 a month. He paid nothing because he was on trial, and Roche has given him continued treatment on compassionate basis. Thankfully, we have Avastin, which is a generic drug, and the price has come down. He travels widely. He's living a great life, and he runs more in one day than I run in a month. He runs like 5 to 10 kilometers a day. I don't know how he does it. But here are the remarkable stories of people who are still alive. So finally, I just wanted to say that generics, biosimilars, and drug repurposing will help bring down drug costs. I'm no expert, and again, our distinguished speakers in the front row are all the experts. But certainly, biosimilars has had a rocky road in the last few years, and I'm told that in the United States, they're starting to make inroads into reducing drug costs, and there's a lot of cost savings using this drug. This is not meant to be an advertisement, but we are big believers in drug repurposing. And me and my colleague John Chia actually ran a trial, which is a phase 3 investigator-initiated trial, to look at the role of aspirin in secondary chemoprevention in a curative setting. So basically, this study is done after surgery for colon cancer, followed by chemotherapy in the adjuvant setting, followed by 3 years of aspirin or placebo. And And we have finished recruitment of 1587 patients, and this is the schema, and it was done during COVID, so it was quite harrowing. And so we finished the trial, and the idea is to see whether we can use aspirin to reduce the rate of disease-free survival relapse. And so this was a massive undertaking. We're pretty proud of the study. Currently, there are 60 sites. In fact, our white knight was Australia. So we had a lot of trouble recruiting until the Australia GI tumor group came in, and we're very close to people like Eva Segalov and John Symes, and I think Prof. Robin Ward will know who I'm talking about. And in fact, there's Daphne Day from Monash, and she's presenting data on biomarkers. So she's looking at circulating tumor DNA to predict relapse in our patient group. There's John and I in China. Again, as I mentioned, my Chinese is terrible. So we had to learn a lot of Chinese as we navigated the Chinese sites. And we are looking at biomarkers as well. So we believe that such studies need to carry on because there are tremendous cost savings for patients. And again, I don't mean to sound like I'm self-pity here, but it took us a monumental effort to raise funding for this trial because it's a generic drug, it's not sexy, it's drug repurposing. But the two adjuvant trials, as some of you oncologists will know, did not succeed. And if they had succeeded, this is basically the cost that you had to pay. It's only $87 to treat patients with aspirin over 3 years. So, I believe there should be more trials like that to address issues with cheap and good drugs. So finally, this is my last slide. As you know, WHO, the Global Economic Impact, they have this global action plan, as well as, of course, Healthier SG and Population Health in Singapore are doing all the right things to prevent cancer and to make sure cancer doesn't come back and to detect it in an earlier stage. So my last slide is a very strange one. I think Prof. Robin Ward will know this place is the University of Sydney. So 2 days ago, we celebrated my dad's 92nd birthday. He's in the clinic right now. He works 7 days a week as a heart specialist. And of course, his two classmates, Gus Nozzle and Jacques Miller, are still alive. But I think in spite of active aging, mahjong, microbiome, living healthily, people still get cancer. And we still need to give them drugs. So even in spite of doing all these things, people will still get cancer. And thank you very much.